Okay, so ready to ditch the duck boats and dive into some of Boston's grittier history?
Let's just say you won't find these stories in any Faneuil Hall gift shop.
Definitely not your typical Freedom Trail souvenir. We're
Yeah.
digging into Boston true crime, and from what I'm seeing here, we're talking about a whole other side to the cradle of liberty.
You could say that. Forget the Tea Party. We're talking brutal home invasions, extortion rings, a city where the mob practically had a stranglehold on certain neighborhoods.
Yeah, the excerpt here mentions something about brutal home invasions and extortion rings. It's a far cry from Boston Pops, that's for sure.
You got that right. And what's really striking is the level of organization. Like, one thing that stood out to me, they talk about specific detail from the source, e.g., a particular tactic used by a gang or a neighborhood terrorized by these home invasions. Just brazen.
And it wasn't just, your typical gangsters either, right? I mean, you've got police corruption and even dirty judges highlighted in your notes here.
Oh, absolutely. We're not just talking about a few bad apples here, though. The source actually uses the phrase web of corruption, which I think really gets at how deeply this stuff ran. I mean, imagine the very people who are supposed to be upholding the law, they were in on it.
Yeah, it's like the excerpt says, it eroded trust, which makes total sense, right? If you can't trust the cops or the judges, who can you trust?
Exactly. And think about the average person living through that, right? The feeling of being totally exposed, vulnerable. It really speaks to the kind of power these criminal organizations wielded.
And speaking of power, you've also got this note here. It mentions they've changed some details in these stories to protect the innocent, which, I don't know about you, but that just screams, things got real.
Oh, yeah. It makes you wonder what they're not telling us, right? Like, what kind of stuff was just too hot to handle even all these years later?
Right. What were the stakes that they had to actually change details to keep people safe?
It definitely wasn't just about legal battles. It was about, like, actual lives being on the line. You hear stories about people who dared to speak out, and, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty.
So we're talking about a Boston
Mm-hmm.
where, the line between right and wrong wasn't just blurred, it was practically non-existent in some circles.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is how this all went down in a city that's so steeped in history, right? Like, you have this legacy of revolution, of fighting for what's right, and then you have this other side, this underbelly where power and corruption were the law of the land.
It's a good reminder that every city, every place has its secrets, has its dark side. And sometimes those shadows, they run deeper than we'd like to think.
For sure. And it makes you think, right? Like, what's lurking beneath the surface of our own cities, our own neighborhoods even, stuff we might never even know about.
Exactly. Makes you wonder what stories those cobblestone streets could tell if they could talk.
The names and certain details in this podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of the individuals involved. While the cases presented are based upon real events, certain facts may have been altered or omitted for confidentiality purposes. Each case is inspired by real legal cases defended by White & Associates PC. This podcast is intended for educational and for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. White & Associates PC does not endorse or guarantee the accuracy or completeness of the information discussed in this episode.